And I'm going to introduce the next speaker, which is Asmeret Berhe from the University of California, Merced. And she's really worked a lot on the soils and having a background as biogeochemist. And she'll tell us much more about things that already have been raised now by Rob and in earlier talks about carbon and soil and stability of soil fractions. Thank you.
Thanks, Wolfgang. Good afternoon, everybody. Really delighted to be here talking about soil. So the rest of my talk, I'll try to cover why, as a soil scientist, I think obviously that the soil system has an important role to play in climate change mitigation. And I'll try to go through a few examples of how we've come to this idea that what components of soil carbon are stable, why they are stable, and how we can engage in particular management of working lands in terrestrial carbon sequestration. So to start with, in my lab, we spend a lot of time thinking about soil organic matter. And we think about soil organic matter, one, because it's this fascinating mixture of compounds that give soil all sorts of beneficial properties, regardless of which direction you're thinking about. But at the same time, we're interested about what happens during changing climates, how soils store carbon and how carbon is stabilized in soil, what happens when soils actually experience degradation. And then, as I mentioned, we'll talk about climate change mitigation that involves soil management, in particular in working lands. And in the last part of my talk, I'll try to focus on deep soil carbon storage. So here I'm trying to get us to think beyond the top 10% or 20, 30 centimeter of soil and think about the entire soil profile, right? Where there's opportunities to actually store and stabilize a lot of carbon. And this is, in my opinion, where the case for improved root phenotypes actually comes in a major way. Okay. So to start with, after the few talks that you've heard especially, and this is not a surprise, right? Soil is an important reservoir of carbon. There's more than 2 times the amount of carbon in soil than just atmosphere and vegetation, even if you combine both of them. And so the soil, you could think about soil as this really important bank reservoir for carbon that can stabilize a lot of the carbon that plants produce with photosynthesis for long periods of time. And the soil is able to actually stabilize carbon that would otherwise have maybe lasted a decade at best, typically about a few years on the soil surface. If it enters the soil system, it could actually last for hundreds of years and thousands of years because of association that could form with minerals. And in this case, I'm in particular thinking about the ability of soil aggregates or mineral assemblages plus organic matter that can physically encapsulate and protect organic matter from decomposition because once carbon is protected physically inside these aggregates, so when it finds itself in the middle of these kinds of an aggregate setup, that it becomes hard for water, for microbes, for enzymes to diffuse into that space and actually degrade the organic matter. The other really important way you can think about carbon is also that organic compounds have a potential to form chemical bonds with the surfaces of reactive minerals. And that is a very important mechanism where carbon that could otherwise, again, could have been decomposed rather easily can persist for up to millennia and even longer. And this is a mechanism that's even stronger in deep soils where you have accumulation of reactive minerals. And so I've kind of come to like this analogy of soil as a carbon bank over time, especially lately in the last couple of years, because it allows us to think about the soil system as a place where there's a lot of carbon that's coming in from plants as they photosynthesize and use CO2 in the atmosphere to build their biomass. And then upon death, obviously, that biomass entering the soil. But once it makes it into the soil, then this bank analogy can be extended to think about different types of carbon, right? So there is some carbon that's going to be particulate, that's going to be free from any association with minerals. And that carbon is the carbon that's fast cycling. So there's a lot of it coming in and a lot of it going out. akin to your checking account, right? But there is that mineral-associated carbon. It could be, again, that physical association with minerals and these aggregates, as well as the chemical association with the surfaces of the reactive minerals. That is more like a savings account, right? If you can figure out a way to feed carbon into that pool, then it could build the account and the size could get a lot bigger and bigger. And that's also where we want that carbon to go if we really want to think about long-term climate mitigation, right? And so, but there's a couple of really important issues that we have to worry about, right? With intensification of agriculture and human use, the soil system's ability to store and sequester carbon is actually getting compromised, right? At this point in time, about half of the world's soils are considered seriously degraded, beyond which their potential, they're seriously degraded to a point where their potential to actually support plant productivity is compromised. So this means, this has important implications, right? Because it means that the soil has lost a lot of carbon during that degradation, but now it potentially also has limited potential to sequester carbon unless we keep pumping it with irrigation water and fertilizers and all sorts of other supplements, which each come with their own carbon costs, right? And so it's really important then to think about how do we bring in particular working lands into this discussion about climate change mitigation, because working lands, again, rangelands, agricultural systems of all sorts is what I'm talking about. There's a large potential, obviously, to store carbon there, as you saw from the couple of different talks today. But depending on how we manage them, these working lands can either be part of the solution or part of the problem, right? They can continue to release large amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, just like working lands have done so, especially since the Industrial Revolution. Or we can think about how we can maximize the amount of carbon that we can store in these soils. And I want to emphasize here that when I think about working lands in terms of climate change mitigation, I want to emphasize that point that Rob made, where increasing carbon in soil is not just good from a climate change perspective, right? These soils have to be rehabilitated, these degraded soils, if we're going to figure out a way to continuously fulfill the food and nutritional security of the growing human population. There's really no way around that question, right? But there's also additional climate benefits we can derive from here. And that's kind of the study that Rob mentioned already, but the idea there is that the way we had managed land in the last 200 years has caused large losses of carbon. And one way we can think about that is an opportunity to bring back at least part of that carbon into the soil by changing our management objectives. And I think that's kind of the point I was making, that reversing this current trend of soil degradation and improving soil health has an important role to play in climate change mitigation. Again, to emphasize, though, that we should think about it. I would like us to avoid thinking about it from just a climate change perspective. There are multiple co-benefits that go along with improved soil health, and those are also as important as climate change mitigation. And in fact, if we start talking about these issues of land degradation and climate change as if they're two different issues, we only stand in our way of actually addressing these two really, really critical environmental problems. Okay, so when we think about climate change, and again, you saw the figure earlier from Ryan's talk, for example, for the increasing concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and that if we don't do anything about it, obviously this concentration of CO2 and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere could keep increasing. But what I'm arguing here, though, is that if we think about a diversified set of solutions that aims to reduce emissions, that would help us slow the rate of change in CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, at the same time that we're actually carefully managing ecosystems to increase the amount of carbon they're storing. This would be that negative emission part that Rob mentioned. Then we actually have a real potential of bending that curve, right? And seeing a more sustainable solution. And there's been all sorts of studies that have been done over the last couple of decades in particular to constrain the magnitude of how much sequestration is actually possible in soil, and how much area can any number of these solutions be implemented in, right? There are some solutions right, including things like grazing land management and cropland management that have a potential to be implemented over large areas. The relative reduction that we get from them is not too high compared to other options, but at least they can be implemented over large areas, and so that benefit can add up. There are others. The amount of area that we can apply these types of benefits of restoring especially degraded histosols, or these organic matter rich soils that are typical of wetlands and those kinds of environments. So the potential to store carbon is really, really high for negative emission in these ecosystems, but there are limited in terms of the geographic area we can apply them. But you get the idea, right? There's an assortment of solutions we can apply, and some of them are, kind of have huge potential to reduce greenhouse gas fluxes into the atmosphere, or even help us with negative emissions. Others have limited potential in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases, but they could still be applied to a large enough area that it could make a huge difference. And I'm going to come back to this figure later on. But the point I want to make about all of these assortment of solution options that we have is that we know they work, right? We know these things work. We know they have a potential to actually work. And we also know that we can achieve these goals in a relatively cost-effective manner. Plus get a bunch of co-benefits to go along with that. From a perspective of air quality, maintaining and improving biodiversity, biodiversity, I should say, and improving access to clean, reliable water, as well as improving soil health. Right? These different colors are what are marked on the side to highlight where those other co-benefits would show up with a range of forest, ag, and grassland and wetland management practices. Right? A range of these ag management practices, for example, can lend themselves to the reason why we're here, to think about root phenotypes and improved phenology overall and how that could help with carbon sequestration. But again, you see that the potential for forest restoration, afforestation, reduced degradation obviously is huge relative to the other benefits. But these other practices also have non-negligible, really important contributions that even come with a range of these other co-benefits. The last part that I wanted to highlight is how a soil biogeochemist like me thinks about soil carbon storage, in particular in deep soils, and the contribution of roots and different root phenotypes for carbon sequestration. We've known for a long time that whenever you have roots and root input of carbon into soil, that soils have a potential to store a lot of carbon, right? We've had studies, that are now almost 15 years old that have been showing that when carbon is incorporated from plants into soil, root and shoot derived carbon tends to act very differently, and that root derived carbon seems to stick to in soil longer. So it doesn't just contribute to carbon storage, but also potential to contribute to carbon stabilization. Part of this was a discussion around whether it has to do with the chemistry of the roots, or whether it is the reactivity of the minerals that are actually available to stabilize the carbon. And in my lab, we spent a lot of time thinking about carbon inputs into deep soils, and we asked this question in a whole sorts of different environments. And here are just two very different types of ecosystems that are among the ones that we're studying at the moment. This is a loess deposit in Nebraska. It's the part we're studying is about 6 meters deep, loose material that was blown away by wind. And we're trying to understand how much carbon is in these deposits, especially in deep soil layers. And we're particularly interested in understanding how this carbon-rich layer that's about 6 meters from the surface and under some of the exposures, for example, how did that get there? And how long does carbon get protected? Because preliminary radiocarbon work that we did suggests that some of this carbon is about 12,000 years old. And so we're trying to understand, in an environment where it's very conducive for decomposition, how did that carbon survive all this time with all sorts of changes in environmental conditions that you can imagine? And then we're asking similar questions in the Sierra Nevada of California in soils that vary considerably in their depth, in their mineralogy, in the amount of carbon that they store along the western slope of the Sierra Nevada. to ask again these similar questions. How much carbon is in soil overall if I actually take a whole soil perspective, a whole soil profile perspective? So if I avoid thinking like just that top part of the soil where there's a lot of high concentration of carbon, which is typically 30 centimeters or A horizon as most people think about it. If I don't focus on just that and I actually try to see to as deep as that soil would go until bedrock contact, how much carbon is there? And what proportion of that carbon is below that layer that we typically use for most of our analysis? And in this study, we find, as in Rob in some previous study that I think you'll see it cited in a lot of deep carbon work, had shown actually that there is a lot of carbon in deep soil layers. And in our studies, we also see the same thing, that more than 50%, in some cases, more than 70% of the carbon that is in the soil in the Sierra Nevada, for example, is below 30 centimeters and below the A horizon. And in fact, about 30% of it is even in weathered bedrock that could be up to 10 meters at depth. What this tells me is that wherever roots find themselves, there's carbon, right? And in the Sierra Nevada soils in particular, we have evidence of roots going down to 6 and 7 meters below the soil surface. And this, in fact, seems to be the mechanism by which the trees that do make it, that are able to weather the extensive drought that we had, seem to have able to do it. They have deep roots that are allowing them to get water from the weathered bedrock. And when they're doing this, in the process, they seem to be leaving some carbon behind. And we've done some radiocarbon dating that suggests that some of this carbon in these deep soil layers, which we're hypothesizing is root-derived, is up to 20,000 years old. So this is really old carbon that somehow made it past a lot of kind of environmental change and a lot of exposure to all sorts of things you can imagine. And then the next question that people like me ask is, how likely is it that carbon will then weather through these climate change conditions that we're working through? What happens if we see drastic change, for example, in the amount of water that's moving through the soil profile? Can it destabilize some of this carbon? And this is partly work that has come, that has been motivated by work that was done at LBL and some work that I did with folks at Davis that suggests that deep carbon seems to actually respond to changes in climate, in particular when changes in temperature are paired with change in precipitation. And so there's a reason to worry that even though deep soils have a large potential to store and stabilize carbon, there might be a potential for some of this carbon to be destabilized under changing environmental conditions. And the other thing to remember is also that whenever roots are growing, and you had carbon that was in the site or in that soil profile in the layer before, there's a potential for the process known as priming, where addition of new carbon, perhaps from rhizodeposition, could actually stimulate decomposition of existing carbon in soil. And there's, again, a range of folks thinking about this question about where is the source of vulnerability for deep soil carbon, that if the plants were able to put it there, can we actually say that it can stay there for good? Or can we constrain the environmental conditions under which it could stay in soil, but then others that maybe it cannot? One of these studies that we're doing is also in collaboration with Jennifer Petridge and her team at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, where our team has sampled soils from multiple areas across the US in areas that had been cultivated by shallow-rooted annuals versus deep-rooted perennials, and where these systems exist side by side so that we can compare them and realize that whatever difference we're observing is simply because of the deep-rooted perennials that were put into place. And every site that has been sampled has been there for at least 10 years. And so we're trying to think about what are the long-term implications of this changing kind of land use towards deep-rooted perennials. So the evidence seems to be clear that bringing in this deep-rooted perennials does does cause higher concentration of carbon. So potential for increased carbon storage seems to be pretty clear. But so far, this new carbon shows up as younger because, again, it's younger, right? So it's mixing with the old pool of carbon. So we're doing a whole range of lab experiments to think about how is the carbon distributed in different soil fractions. Remember the checking versus the saving account. Where is the soil stashing this carbon that it's getting? Is it going to help with long-term storage? To what extent? We're also looking into the composition of organic matter and how it might vary between these two systems that are side by side, and also think about the microbial community composition and particular activity of microbes that could potentially destabilize this carbon, in particular at deep soil layers, because it's pretty clear that there's a lot of carbon going into deeper soil layers. So we want to think about what is the likelihood that it's going to stay there, and how can we think about the mechanisms that are going to dictate basically how much potential long-term benefit for carbon sequestration can be derived from these deep-rooted perennial systems. So to get back to that figure that I mentioned, this study is actually in agreement with that, with the findings and the summary and synthesis that Postian and others provided, where these enhanced root phenotypes have a very significant potential, right, to contribute towards climate change mitigation, to the tune of about 1 petagram of CO2 per year mitigation potential. So that's huge, right? And what excites me even more is the fact that this comes with a whole range of co-benefits, right, for improving soil health and improving plant productivity that we need, again, to ensure the food and nutritional security. And in further, if you think about this figure, the 4 per mil initiative also fits in particular as it's related to restoration of degraded lands, right? And I want to emphasize that you've heard about the 4 per mil initiative, and you've also heard that it's sometimes criticized as maybe it's a bit overambitious, right? But I think to me that's a little bit beside the point, right? If we actually start working towards goals that increase soil carbon storage and sequestration overall, even if we do not make it to that total goal of offsetting 1/3 of the global fossil fuel emissions, and we still just make some strides towards that goal, we still end up with some benefits for climate change and still end up with improved soil health conditions that, again, is very important for a whole variety of reasons. With that, I will just say that I think soil is a really important part of the solution for climate change mitigation. And I'll leave you, oops, I don't know what happened there. Oh, it's going. Bonus slides if you ask questions, but somehow it decided to do its thing. So it's okay. I think I'll stop. Okay.